Ano ai me ke aloha ya kākoa pau, and welcome again to our second filmed conversation on Mākau mo'omeheu, otherwise known as cultural competence. My name is Helena Kapuni Reynolds, and I am a board member of the Hawaiʻi Museums Association, a nonprofit dedicated to communication and cooperation among the staff and supporters of museums and related institutions in Hawaii. With the support of the Hawaii Tourism Authority, our organization began to organize a series of webinars and filmed conversations around the topic of cultural competence in Hawaii's museums. To learn more about this initiative, please visit our website at www.hawaiimuseums.org/Mākau. Today, we're filming two panels at the Hilo Yacht Club, which is in Ka'umealani in Keaukaha. And joining us today are esteemed museum professionals and cultural knowledge holders that will help us to understand the importance of cultural competence in making Hawaii's museums more relevant to local communities. Our first panel consists of our cultural competence educators, including myself, Helen Wang-Smith, and Dr. Teresa Vunidilo, and we'll be discussing cultural competency as a framework and sharing examples of how cultural competency can improve the relationships that museums have to their employees, volunteers, patrons, and artists. Our second panel is a conversation with cultural practitioners and knowledge holders hailing from Hawaii Island, including Noenoe Wang Wilson, Lynn Elia, and Iliahi Anthony, each of whom will introduce themselves more at the beginning of the second panel. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to offer 3 olalo no'eau that will help us to ground this conversation in Hawaiian values and practices. So the first olalo no'eau that I'd like to talk about today is huli kalima I lalo, ola. Huli kalima I luna, make. If your hands are turned downward, you will thrive, but if your hands are turned upward, you will not go too far. And I'd like to bring this olalo no'eau up because it speaks to the importance of putting in the work. As you'll hear in the next panel, cultural competence isn't just something that you can pick up one day and use it. It's actually something that you'd have to develop over time, and you have to be willing to put in the work. Huli kalima I lalo, to put your hands down, is in reference to the fact that to grow your own food, to grow kalo, to grow ulu or uala, you need to put your hands in the soil. You need to do the hard work of pulling the weeds, of preparing the soil, of planting the plants. And so this is what this olalo no'eau is alluding to, is that we can't be afraid of having these conversations and creating the changes that we need within ourselves so that we can be culturally competent. The second olalo no'eau that I wanted to bring up today is kui kamana. Kui kamana. Translated, it means to be like the one from whom you have learned. And I wanted to bring this olalo no'eau up today because this is quite a special panel for me as someone who went to school right down the road at the Edith Kanaka Ole Foundation site, Pahoaka. And Kui Kamana was the model for our school. I went to Keaukaha Public Charter School. And with regards to cultural competence, I thought it would be quite apt to bring it up during this conversation because it speaks to the ways in which each of us are raised differently. Our ohana imbued within us, or, from our ohana, we've inherited different traits, different traditions, different ways of behaving, different ways of interacting with one another, different ways of communicating with one another. And so Kui Kamana reminds us that through cultural competence, it requires us to be patient, to listen closely, but to also recognize that someone might be acting in a particular way because that is how they're raised, or that is what their tutu taught them, or that is what they saw their mother doing, and so they are performing some of the same behaviors. And so when we're talking about changing attitudes and changing the way in which we communicate and collaborate with one another within our institutions, we need to recognize this and to be patient with folks who, may have a little bit of a harder time understanding what cultural competence is, but who might be more willing to put in the work, especially if we can meet them where they're at. And the third olalo no'eau that I'd like to bring up, since we're at beautiful Ka'umealani near the ocean and hearing the waves, is ho'okahi ka'ilau like ana. Ho'okahi ka'ilau like ana. Wield the paddle together. Ilau in particular is a word that is heavily associated with voyaging traditions. It's essentially a word that talks about paddling together. And as I've mentioned with the two olalo no'eau prior, this olalo no'eau is great to just recognize that cultural competency is not something that an individual can do. It takes a village, as we like to say it here in Hawaii and in other parts of the Pacific, to create those kinds of changes. So ho'okahi ka'ilau like ana. So with these three olalo no'eau to kind of create the foundation for our talks today, let's jump into our first panel. So Helen and Teresa, aloha, thank you again for joining us today. And what I'd like to do is we'll start with Helen. And will you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey? And how long have you been formally engaged in cultural competency work?
Oh, mahalo, Helena. I started out in the early 80s with Marion Kelly as a Hawaiian Studies student that before we even had a Hawaiian Studies college or program, it had to be a sort of a self-developed degree under liberal studies. And my mentors included Pua Hopkins and Marion Kelly, and I learned so much about cultural competency from their aspect because they were really fighting the dominant culture at that time. And so I learned so much from them as far as their acceptance of other cultures, when it was appropriate to push back. I remember when the Hawaiian collection at Hamilton Library limited their hours to their collection further than, if we're going to cut anything, we're going to cut the Hawaiian collections hours. And Marion Kelly telling the leader, the library director, that's racist. You will not do that. So I love that woman. So it's been something that I wasn't aware that I was being exposed to this because there was no term for it back then. And throughout my career, I have been the victim of several EEO violations, because of my culture, my gender. And gender is not, culture is not just ethnicity. That's what I always want to make sure people realize, that it is much broader. And so it is ageism, it is how you treat anybody who's unlike yourself. So when I learned of cultural competency, the framework of it, when I was working at the Daniel K. Inouye College of Pharmacy, I realized that this had much wider application than just for traditionally medical field or social work, where it pretty much has been practiced for several decades. And I brought it to the Society of American Archivists, and so it really resonated with them. And I think for cultural heritage institutions like museums, archives, libraries, it is so very important because, especially for museums and archives, if we don't recognize the other cultures that we are working with, or that we should be working with, and how to effectively communicate, we lose so much of our memory, so much of our cultural memories. And my argument is that, I said this once when I was interviewed on Kauai, and I said, we shouldn't be just keeping things of the rich white people. And I said just judges and mayors, and I realized, oh my God, the president of my board is a judge, but he was a Hawaiian judge. But anyway, so it's been a very important tool to communicate to cultural heritage repositories and institutions that this is the time that we have to grab it. We have to, with all the ethnography I had learned through Marion Kelly and such, it was recognizing the wealth of knowledge and the mana'o of the different cultures that too often we forget about because we're so busy going after the quote important records of the well-known people. Those days are done. We have to recognize how to capture it, and you can't do it without being culturally competent. Too often you go out and you say, we outreach to this group and we've noticed that we're culturally competent. No, you're not. So this is the type of framework that I am passionate about because it provides a mechanism to work with different cultures.
Thank you, Helen. Now, so far we've been talking about cultural competency, but we haven't quite defined it yet. And so I was hoping, as someone who has gone around the country and around the state talking about cultural competence, particularly within the archival community, if you could provide us with kind of your summarization of this term, cultural competence, or how we've kind of been using the term Mākau mo'omeheu here. And, over time, as someone who has discussed this with others and who have presented, has your definition changed to consider other things over time?
Thank you. The definition that I would give is it's the ability to function with awareness, and that's the hard part. Self-awareness. When I give my workshop, my full-day workshop across the country, I don't give those. I often disregard people unlike myself because nobody's going to admit that. No one's going to say that they're culturally incompetent. So it's that self-awareness that's part of the whole process. So you have to function with awareness, knowledge, taking the effort to become knowledgeable about the culture that you're working with, and interpersonal skill when engaging with people of different backgrounds, assumptions, beliefs, values, or behaviors. And too often we're just kind of thrown off like, oh, wow, why are they acting that way? Well, there's probably a reason for it, and it might be part of their culture. So that's the definition that I work from. And it's not so much that I've seen it change, but I think it's more of an awareness or a lack of that when people go out and work with a different group, but they don't adopt that viewpoint to be knowledgeable, to take the effort to be knowledgeable. And like your Olelo no Eau, is if you're not welcoming, if you're not open to the other culture or the behaviors or the skill sets or such, then it's very difficult to be culturally competent. And too often I see people do that. They do the facade, of doing the outreach, but then they are not really practicing the interpersonal skills that lend themselves to cultural competency.
So from your own experiences, could you provide us with an example of what does cultural competency look like when it's applied, when someone is implementing it in their daily interactions with someone or an individual in the institution? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I don't want to use the same example we have used in the past, so I'm going to say one that's a little different. It's a little more academic. I know of a university, I would just say, because let's give them kudos, UNLV. They have changed their process of hiring new faculty. And what they have changed is that they now spread the announcement, the job ad, position announcement beyond the traditional academic places. They will reach out into different communities, different cultures, and they will let people know that way. And it takes effort, because we're so accustomed to doing it, let's just publish it in the Chronicle of Higher Education. But it takes effort to identify those different cultures, the venues that are available there, and they advertise there. Their rubric for who they're going to interview has changed dramatically. So sometimes not all of us publish as much, but we do a heck of a lot of public speaking to small groups. And that community outreach should not be undervalued, because sometimes you're more comfortable, depending on your culture, you might be more comfortable working with a small group, and that group it made the world a difference to them, because they can now take care of their own artifacts, or they can take care of their own records, or start gathering oral histories and such. So those are it should not always have to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so they have switched the weight that they give to who they're going to interview, who they're going to select, and then also what I would implore people to do is that also for promotion and consideration and support, because if you're comfortable with public speaking, okay, great for you. But what's so sad to me is that I have read scholarly articles that advise Asian librarians, okay, if you want to get ahead in this world, you got to be more like the Caucasians. You have to speak to bigger audiences. You have to speak at conferences and such. And it's telling us, don't be yourself, be more like the dominant culture. So that is what I encourage people to consider, different changes like that can be done. And yay, UNLV.
I love that example so much, because I think it resonates with some of the things that I think about with regards to hiring practices in museums. Oftentimes when we think of who a collection manager or who a curator looks like and what they should do, doesn't necessarily capture all of the amazing work that other folks who might be qualified for those positions encapsulate. As someone, I dress up in my aloha shirt and shorts and very local style, but I could never see myself really working at a high-end institution because I'm not a suit and tie kind of person. That's not how I grew up. That's not what makes me comfortable. And I could never really see myself having to dress that way on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't make my work less important or relevant. There's certain styles that I think, particularly within our institutions, we're slowly trying to unravel and unpack a little bit more, because at the end of the day, you want people who are going to put in the work. As you've mentioned with UNLV, it's because they put in the work that they've been able to diversify staff, faculty hires, things like that. So.
And that's a huge point, because too often, especially in Hawaii, we have always assumed that, oh, this person, look, they have a this, and look at their credentials and such. And what burns us so often is that this is a stepping stone, or as one dean said, I'm tired of people coming here and this is their Hawaiian vacation. They apply for a position here and, it's a 7-year plan and they're out of here. But when you have somebody, if you open it up, and especially if you have somebody from that particular culture, they are invested. And you can teach people skill sets, but you can't teach the knowledge, the intimate knowledge that you have with this area. You can't teach the passion that someone has when it's there, or the familiarity. Somebody can learn, sure, but that doesn't equate to it's happened in Hawaii also. Who are our, look at the university statistics. We have this many students of color, and still over 50% of the faculty is white. I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying it is not reflective of the culture here in Hawaii. So this is the type of shift I'd like to see, that we stop assuming that because somebody is from someplace else with these accolades or what have you, that they are the most appropriate fit for that museum position.
Thank you, Helen. All right, we're going to ask a few questions now for Dr. Teresa Vunidilo. Thank you again for joining us today. And similar to Helen, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey and how you ended up becoming a museum studies scholar?
Mahalo nui. Bulavinaka. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. As I'm a visitor to the shores of Hawaii, I'm originally from Fiji. I was here 27 years ago as a student, and I really acknowledge that opportunity of me coming to study here in 1993 because it opened up the door for me to understand anthropology and to understand archaeology. Because these fields of study that I came to study opened up the door when I returned to Fiji, and an advertisement was opened at the Fiji Museum at that time. And so when I found in the newspaper, I saw the advertisement and I looked at the word archaeology and I was like, I remember that word. I learned that word. And so I opened up the newspaper and read about it and I put in my application. And so fast forward to today, I've been in the museum sector since 1994. When I graduated at the University of the South Pacific, and I went on to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and I've moved to Australia, and now I'm here in Hawaii, still in the field of museums. There's something about museums that I really enjoy, particularly for me being an indigenous Itoke or indigenous Fijian, and I always feel privileged of working in the museum collections. And every time I'm within the, working with artifacts or digging, doing excavations all around Fiji, I always want to tell the story, and I want to tell the story to my people. First of all, that was very important to me. And so that kind of led me to this particular moment when we're talking about cultural competency, and for me being here in Hawaii as an academic here at the UH Hilo has allowed me to really share my knowledge, my passion, and what I know, not only with Fijians, but with other indigenous students and faculty members. So that's kind of like in a nutshell my journey across Oceania.
Yes, and you've lived in quite a few places across the Pacific, haven't you?
Yes.
So I know that you've lived in Aotearoa or New Zealand for quite some time, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about some of the work that you've done there in terms of cultural competence, specifically with regards to your work of reconnecting Fijian communities in New Zealand to their collections that are housed at these places. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. After working in Fiji for a number of years, and when I moved to Aotearoa, I realized that a lot of my own Fijian people, they were not aware that there are Fijian artifacts in museums down the neighborhood. They keep saying, I'm going to go back to Fiji to visit the Fiji Museum. And so I started talking to them to say, did you know that they have artifacts from your island right over there? And they were like, really? And so I started, creating programs for children. I started doing it with a keiki, getting them to come into the museum and organize fun programs for them. And through the children, the parents can come along. So that's kind of like the strategy that I did, work with the children. The mom and dad, they will definitely uproot from whatever they're doing to join the children. And so when I went to the Waikato Museum, same thing happened. Fijians there did know that there were artifacts there. So when I was working at the Waikato Museum, I want to acknowledge the director at that time, Kate Vusonuelala, who was my director in Fiji. And for some reason, we connected in Waikato. And so she kept telling me, Teresa, you and your team, you must work with the community. You must work with the community. And so I asked her, what do you mean by the word community? And she was saying, it is the people. And it kind of connect very well with one of the proverbs in Aotearoa, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It's a people, it's a people, it's a people. And so we use that concept to work with the community. So we work with the Indian community, Korean community, Tangata Whenua community, Somali community, and of course with my Fijian community. And it opened up the door, for my people to also realize there's artifacts in this room. We have to go and see. And then I came to Auckland. Same thing happened. And so it's kind of like this program is following me around, and I actually believe in it. And I know that if we get our people to come in and connect with the artifacts, we are actually breathing life to the artifacts, So it's not just an object, it is an artifact with a name, with a history, with people that are associated with it. To me, that's what matters the most. And that's kind of what I really, really enjoyed when I was working in Aotearoa. Not only just working alone in a room in the museum, but working with our people. And that's just so satisfying.
I think what you bring up is so important because it illustrates, as the person within an institution that has to facilitate this reconnecting with collections, of bringing community in. That person needs to have the patience and understanding to realize that this is the first time a lot of these folks are reconnecting with objects from their home communities. And that can be a very emotional process. It can be a very difficult process. Sometimes it can be a little haphazard, however it is set up, but that's a part of the entire experience that staff or whoever is involved in the project should take account of. And I think, the work that you've done there and some of your colleagues, I think you folks did such an excellent job of facilitating that and really trying to create, in some ways, a new culture around museum visitation with regards to Pacific communities. Oftentimes, I know here in Keaukaha, there's lots of people who will say, well, I've never been to a museum locally because I don't feel like it's for me.
Right.
And so that's a mind shift that I think we're slowly trying to grapple with and to understand, well, how do we make these places where, our local families can take their kids, or where the kids feel like, let's go there for something to do instead of this is where all the tourists go or something like that. So thank you for that. Lastly, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Pacific Island Museum Association. Now, I know that you are the Secretary General of the organization, and I think PIMA and having you here in Hilo in particular has been so valuable to really reinvigorate some ties that PIMA as well as the Hawaiʻi Museums Association kind of developed years ago. So could you tell us more about PIMA and its function and why it's so important to have to have a regional Pacific Museum Association, particularly for Pacific Islanders who work within museum and related spaces?
Thank you. Yes, so PIMA, I have to acknowledge Hawaii, that the idea of PIMA was born here in Honolulu at the East West Center in 1993. Exactly the same year I was studying here as a student, there was a group of museum directors meeting in East West Center. And that's when they realized that the Pacific, as we all know, is very diverse in size, covered with oceans, and we have people who speak different languages. So you can imagine in Papua New Guinea, we have more than 800 languages. And then on top of that, we have English language, Spanish, and French. So with all this diversity, I really have to acknowledge Malivoi, one of my colleagues from Papua New Guinea. He was the director of UNESCO at that time in Samoa. He came up with the idea and talked to the directors of the museum at the East West Center, telling them we need to have a unified voice. We need to have all the museums talking to one another, but also an organization to be the voice. And so PIMA was born. And so we were very grateful that when I became a staff at the Fiji Museum after my graduation, the Fiji Museum was hosting PIMA in the office in Fiji. So I was kind of aware of what the organization was all about, and I could see the benefit of it because there's over 45 museums and cultural center under one roof. We have the office based in Port Vila in Vanuatu, and the current president is Joseph Cameron, and he's from Guam. And we have board of directors or board of the PIMA board all over the Pacific. So they represent each of the island or the three regions of Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. Yes, so I believe that PIMA really plays a very important role. We are a sister organization to the Hawaiʻi Museums Association. And for me, working as the Secretary General for PIMA and being in Hawaii, it just kind of all makes sense. It's sort of like I feel it's an alignment of the stars, It seems like Hawaii is where everything kind of started, and here I am. And so I'm just so honored that I can sit here representing PIMA, and I've been sharing it to all the PIMA board members and the PIMA members to say, hey, I'm here in Hawaii, but I'm also wearing the PIMA hat, and the museum work that I'm doing is reconnecting back to the Pacific. And even with the Mākau Mokumeheu webinar, we've actually had some members joining in from Kiribati, from the smaller islands. So I just want to acknowledge Hawaiʻi Museums Association, and again, the wonderful work that you're supporting for us, for PIMA in the Pacific.
I know that's been quite exciting. Previously, we've organized a few webinars.
Yes.
And, to see folks calling in from Aotearoa, from Fiji. I think there was one from Norfolk Island.
Norfolk Island.
And so it's just incredible to see what these online platforms and how it's allowing us to reconnect and to connect to broader, more regional communities. So that's been fantastic. Thank you so much, Teresa. All right, so these questions are going to be for both of our panelists, and we'll start with Helen. And so the first question is, we've been organizing a series of webinars and these filmed conversations. This is our second filmed conversation now, for quite some time. And I think it's given us a little bit of time to reflect and to think about, how people have been responding or perceiving of it. But even currently during this COVID times, I think we've been seeing a lot of examples of cultural competency in practice and not in practice. So based on your experiences as cultural competence educators, working locally here in Hawaii, oftentimes nationally as you travel, and internationally, how do you think the conversation around cultural competency is shifting?
I think that it is shifting in the sense that people are now in our sectors, in cultural repositories, it's shifting to realize that, that's what was missing. Or, now I can see where we did this and it was poorly attended, or didn't generate the kind of... We assumed that culture would come out, and support us, and they didn't. And so I think people are beginning to recognize that maybe there was something I could have done, or the museum could have done, or the organization could have done to approach it slightly differently. So I have been surprised just by sharing the news about our webinars. I've had people who are one was in Arkansas, and one was in DC, and one was in Texas, saying, this is perfect. My Hispanic, student is interested in going into museums, and this is perfect. I'm going to have her watch this. Or my son just moved from Kentucky to Hawaii, and so he really needs to understand this. So that's been the wonderful response. I haven't had too much, if there are negative responses, they haven't said anything to me, but that's been far-reaching, much more than I think what we had intended this series to address. So I'm thrilled to see that external reach.
Absolutely. Teresa?
Yes, I kind of really look at our webinars as very inclusive. It's kind of including everybody from different walks of life, different cultural heritage backgrounds. But I also am interested because I'm a teacher. I've also kind of invited some of my students to join in, and that's something I really learned from the webinars, that it's kind of cut across a lot of the spectrum of society. So it's not only just the few, or not only just the qualified, or not only just the graduates, but it's also opened the door for the younger ones to come in. Because I believe that, I'm not getting any younger, we're getting older, but I really want to get the younger generations to also be excited to join this field. And I saw that the webinar was a platform for that. It was something that, I'm not, it's sort of like, I have to be this old to join. It was anybody. Even for Kiribati and the Norfolk Island, everyone connecting in. So that's something kind of, I saw the shift where there's more inclusivity into the Talanoa, and I love it.
Fantastic. I think the only thing I'd like to add is, having participated in and moderating many of these discussions, one of the things that I've observed is that for myself as a young museum professional, as someone slowly working his way up the ranks in some ways, it's been quite interesting to see the differences generationally with regards to some of our knowledge holders who are kupuna, who are elders, as opposed to some of our younger knowledge holders. And just the different perceptions and relationships that folks have with institutions. I remember with one of our earlier webinar series, one of our presenters was kind of sharing their experiences of visiting another institution and not really having the best experience. And one of our audience members who was there, who knows the staff fairly intimately, was a bit frustrated. And this is someone else who has kind of worked in the field, but I could understand some of those where some of those frustrations can come from, especially if you're someone who is who's doing that hard work over the years, building those relationships, trying to increase access, and to have it criticized can be hurtful in some ways. But that's something that I think we see more of now and now, as we see more Indigenous students in particular wanting to come into the profession, whether it's in museums or archives, historical sites, whatever you name it. There's going to be a perception of this institution isn't doing enough. But I think it's important to recognize that, as young folks, we need to reach out and we need to have conversations with those who have been in the institutions for decades, particularly our Indigenous aunties and uncles who have worked there, who may be close to retiring, who have retired, because they'll be able to provide us with some more information, or at least to appreciate the work that's been done. Because we never start with a blank slate. It's always building off of what someone else has put before us. Okay, so the next question that I'd like to ask is, how can museums and other repository leaders make the space to practice cultural competency? And can they foster a holistic approach to change, given the fact that their agencies may be part of larger bureaucratic systems? This one's a little bit of a tricky question, but let's have Teresa respond first this time.
Okay. I think, the libraries and the museums and the archives, the gardens, the national parks, like we all have the same audience. And so I think it'll be very smart in a way that leaders in these organizations should work together, with one another. So collaboration is the key. And, we can have shared knowledge, shared resources, and shared understanding within all these organizations, even though we have different focus, with artifacts or paper materials or historical records, but it's the people that we all targeting here. And so that's sort of something that I always kind of preach about, which is the 3 C's, collaboration, culture, or the people, or focus on the cultural aspect of our people, and community. And to me, if all institutions, utilize their strengths, and at the same time, it doesn't mean that we're going to kind of like all overlap with one another. I can still feel that we can still provide the edge. What is different? What is different from the archives to the library? What is special and unique for the libraries to the museum and the rest of it? So that's kind of like my vision for the future, for any museum director or library director or archives director that is watching this presentation, yes, to encourage a lot of our organization to talk with one another, because it seems like through my own experience, it's always like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Or in one organization, everybody's working in silo. And so those walls need to be, pulled down and have people talk to one another and share the resources and the stories that we all have in common with a community that we're working with. So that's my vision.
Thank you. Helena?
Just dovetailing into Teresa's vision, collaboration. I'm a former president of the Hawaiʻi Library Association and the Association of Hawaiʻi Archivists, and at that time, I approached Betty Cam, who was president of the Hawaiʻi Museums Association. I said, we have to have a local controlled vocabulary, because every repository has their own local subject headings. And it's so difficult for the researcher to go to one facility and say, let me see all your artifacts or all your records on this, but, oh, it's not cataloged that way, or it's not categorized that way, that if we all come together and we have one that's universal throughout. Let's start with Hawaii before the whole South Pacific. Yes. But at least with Hawaii, then you have the same search methodology. So that is something that I've always advocated for. And a couple of young librarians are getting going quite a ways with that. But it can't be done without collaboration. You have to have all the sectors discussing it. As far as making space for cultural competency, is that they can start with assessing, doing an assessment survey. Who makes up your staff? Who are your patrons? Who are your community? If your patrons is just a small sector and your community is this diverse as it is here, then something is amiss. And don't hire that one person from that culture as your token brownie. Don't do that. That is, I see too many organizations. Let's use the example on the mainland. They have one Hispanic faculty member or one Hispanic archivist, and that person has to handle all of the responsibilities for his. No, everybody on the staff should be culturally competent. So recognizing the non-traditional skill sets of your workers, and to avoid promoting that person that you're most like. It's museums and archives have traditionally been pretty homogeneous, and we have the opportunity to make it much more diverse, and this is the time to do it. So.
Just two comments to add. When you were talking, I started thinking about this book that I've read a few months ago that I'd like to return to. It's called The Anarchist's Guide to Historical House Museums. I think that's the title. But it's this great little publication about how do you turn everything upside down in the historic house museum that you work at to bring in more people, to diversify. And it's funny because one of the things that they list as like an anarchist practice, which it isn't really, is maybe your staff should just walk around the community and talk to people. I thought that was such a great example of how do you connect and how do you get to know the local culture in which your institution exists. And just talking to your neighbors, going up and down the street, seeing who's there, saying hi, I work here, we'd love to have you over at some point. And I thought that was so great of an example to show why it's important for institutions to go beyond their walls in so many ways, to bring in the folks that they want within their institutions. And then my second point, over the past few years, one of the things that is constantly repeated to me at various talks that I've been to or have helped to organize, and I think would be relevant for this particular question, is to have a budget line item dedicated to cultural competence when you're developing your budgets. I know that's something that institutions, particularly at this time, are trying to balance out their budgets because of the cuts in visitorship, of funding. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still try to figure out a way to have that budget line item, whether it's to do the assessment, to have some kind of event, to hire somebody who can help you to do these kinds of initiatives. So that's something that I've learned over the past few years because a few folks have mentioned it, and I just wanted to reiterate it that I think that's something else to include as well, is that it needs to be in the budget for it to be meaningful, particularly if you're thinking at it from the institutional level. All right, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to end with one more question. And this question is, if you could give advice to students interested in working in museums and related historical repositories, what would that advice be? And so let's have Helen answer first.
I've always mentored students throughout my career, and I'm happy to say some of them have exceeded me. I mean, they've gone to fabulous places. And the most recent ones are still very timid. There are twins from Keaukaha, on Kauai. They came to Hilo, and they just finished the library program at Manoa and are looking for One has a position at the Hula Hula Preservation Society, and the other one, I'm trying to get her a position in another repository, and they're still timid. They're saying, "Oh, I'm not sure," and I'm like, no, do not be timid. You have, yes, you're from Keaukaha, and it doesn't matter where you're from and who you're up against. You put your name in there. You put it out. You let them tell you no, and if they tell you no, you ask why. This is, there's so much of when you're here, when you grow up in the local culture, you're so accustomed of not necessarily asserting yourself to a level that someone from another culture that's second nature to them. It's a learned skill that I always encourage them. You put your name in there. Let me call. Put me down as a reference. Let me call. I know somebody there. Utilize that. And don't shy away from that. Don't undervalue what you have to bring to the table.
Mm. Yes, I think for me, is for those maybe young ones that are listening in today, to really share what I call, I've just created one, which is the 3 I's. So 3 I's. So the first one is acknowledge the ingenuity of your people. I think that's the key. To really get our young ones to appreciate themselves and their ohana and their ancestors. We have so much, mana and amazing stories and indigenous knowledge that has been passed on for thousands of years. And that needs to be nurtured and passed on to the next generation. So that's my first one, ingenuity. And the second one is integrity. So whatever little knowledge that you may think you have, it's not little. A lot of us are born into families that have captured all this knowledge over the years. Use them. Work with your elders is what Helen has just talked about. Not to be shy about it and be proud of it. The third one is be an inspiration. Be an inspiration to the young up-and-coming ones that are coming up, and you can be one. An inspirational person to the ones coming up. So those are the 3 I's that I want to share with our young ones, and I'm sure they can enjoy and, have a wonderful career in the field of heritage. It's fun.
I love the point that you make within the second I of ingenuity, is that something that you might think of as a practice that's kind of manini, kind of small within your family, is actually quite important.
Yes.
I oftentimes think about this because of my own tutu. She's 93. She grew up in Hilo in particular. Didn't learn the language, but did hear her grandparents and parents speaking the language. Didn't really learn a lot of the quote-unquote cultural practices. But when you talk to her and she shares stories, she remembers words that they used. And even certain types of behaviors that we wouldn't necessarily initially think of as being Hawaiian are. If you do the back end and you over time you realize, oh, that is something that they inherited. And even if, in her case, even though she doesn't speak Hawaiian or engage in a cultural practice in a particular form, that doesn't make her anything less.
It's innate.
It's
another
innate.
I.
Yes,
It's
another
The
I.
fourth I, yes. So I just wanted to add that because, there oftentimes we feel this pressure to perform our indigeneity in one way or another.
Right.
But there's so many facets of it that, I think even when we think of cultural competence in our communities, it's about recognizing that everybody, again, has those different trajectories or genealogies of practice that we need to acknowledge and recognize and let people be who they are in a lot of ways. And that's, it's a big task, and that's why, one of the Olalono'eau to start was talking about the work that goes into this. It's not easy. It's something that you have to constantly work at, not just for a week, but over your lifetime. To be someone who can be more empathetic, who is more patient and understanding with others, and to, in the ultimate goal of creating the communities and workplaces that we want to see for ourselves, hopefully at some point, but also for the future the next generation of those who are going to take over when we're no longer here. So mahalo e Helen, ame Teresi, for that wonderful kuka kuka. We hope you, the viewers, also have learned a little bit of something with regards to cultural competency and museum work here in Hawaii. Before we move on to our next panel, we're going to cut to a short break because we need to rearrange some things. And we need to invite our next speakers up. So he ho'i mai koi, we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our second panel here in Hilo, Hawaii. As I mentioned earlier, this panel features cultural practitioners and knowledge holders based here on Hawaii Island. And joining us today are Dr. Noenoe Wong Wilson, Lynn Elia, and Iliahi Anthony. And we've asked each of these speakers to share with us today some of their experiences and perspectives regarding Hawaii Island museums and related repositories. So aloha and Noenoe, Lynn, ame Iliahi, thank you so much for joining us today. So my first question is just to get to know you folks a little bit better. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in your current career path or cultural practice? And we'll give the stage first to Dr. Wong.
Oh, aloha.
Aloha.
I'm really happy to be here today, Helena. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this forum. I'm a Hilo resident, born and raised on Oahu in Kailua. But I spent my academic career beginning here in Hilo at the University of Hawaii, at Hilo at Hawaii Community College. And I went on from my anthropology degree at the university to Manoa, where I received my master's in Pacific Island Studies, and then finally to University of Waikato in Aotearoa, where I received my PhD in the School of Maori and Pacific Development. So I actually finished my formal schooling quite late in life. I spent most of my earlier years, of course, working and in the business community and with state government. So toward the end of my career, I was teaching at the community college in the Hawaiian Studies program and operating a student success program for Native Hawaiians as well. And since then, I'm retired. But, retired just means that your life changes a little bit, but still your kuleana to the community remains. And I'm as busy as ever and still working in the community and with the community and for the community and in some of the really important things that face us today.
Wonderful, thank you. Next we'll go to Lynn.
Aloha. My name is, you know my name already, Kalamai. I live in Kauleao, Puna. That's where I grew up. And then eventually came back home and raised my family there. I've been living there for over half my life. I applied for a job at the Hawaiʻi Museum through Alolike. And I believe one of the reasons why they wanted to hire me is because Kaipo Frias is my hula brother. We both dance for Halau Kekuhi. And he knew I knew stuff because we are in hula together. And eventually, I would be giving outreach programs in the Hawaiian culture to the elementary students, mostly beginning in 4th grade. So that was my job. I started there in part-time, giving those programs as well as learning the interpretation of the entire museum, its historic home and the galleries. And I was about to leave that job for better pay and maybe a little closer to home because I traveled at that time, it probably was an hour drive or almost an hour drive one way. And but then I had the opportunity during that time to work with the curator of collections and exhibits, and we as staff were the ones to put together the exhibits with the curator. And then I got to work with the collections, do exhibits, paint walls, whatever. The staff was there to assist him. And so he said there would be a position open for the registrar. And he said, you need to apply. I want you to apply, and I will help you. And so, you know how you don't feel like you know nothing about it, really, although you helped out in that area a little bit. So I was competing with other people from the mainland, mostly in that position, because I did apply. And I got the job because the curator said, I want her. And that was that was a turning point in my work in museums. I've been at the Lyman Museum for about 35 years, and I am still employed by the Lyman Museum. And I had another job description added on to my role as the registrar. I've been the collection manager for many years as well. So, yeah. And I continue to be in that capacity. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Helen and Teresa said, especially Helen. And Helen talked a little bit about the token, okay, the token person you have in there. And I don't know how far this video is going to reach, but, you know, that was a comment that I heard for me when I got the job as registrar, as a token Hawaiian. And I'm not sure I understood it well at that time, but I felt that, you know, there's a purpose for me, that I'm still here and didn't leave the job. So there is a purpose. And so there are many other Hawaiians working in institutions, not just Hawaiian, you know, Native Hawaiians or Hawaiian people, but people who actually are from here. This is their lifeblood, as much as not having the koko, but it's their lifeblood, I believe. And so I was not really a token, but, you know, to just hear those words, sometimes it's like, it's not true. So you have to break that. Yeah. So hopefully I broke it, because you see many more Hawaiians in the capacity at institutions like museums and even in archives. Hawaiian people, indigenous Hawaiian, native, you know, but as well as people, like Helen said, you take from here and you lift them up and you put them into here, because this is where their passion is. This is where their life is. And it's important that we do that as we move forward. Yeah. It's important.
Thank you, Lynn.
Mahalo.
All right. And Ili?
Aloha, I'm Iliahi Anthony. I grew up in this area, Waika Palekai, Ha'ilele Iwi. That was our stomping grounds. And I went to Keaukaha Elementary and then Hilo High. So I was born in Oahu, but I was raised in Hilo. And I grew up in the halau, in Halau Kekuhi, since I was 4. So I was dancing in the halau for over 30 years. And I think that's definitely where my making maybe was triggered. That's where the love for making things came from. I think that I learned lots of what I know, including behaviors from aunties and uncles in the halau. Those are the people that raised me. I was there all the time, and so I think that my skills come from, I pulled something from every single one of them, and now I enjoy working with plants, lei making and dyeing and those kinds of things, and I consider myself a fiber maker. I'm not a master of anything, but a fiber artist, and and then so still in the halau and learning more things every single time, but I got a BFA from Hilo, and then I eventually years later, when after my BFA, I went to the East Coast and I got a MFA in furniture design. And I think a lot of people think like, oh, that's so strange that you went from hula to furniture. But I think when you live in a community like Keaukaha and you come from a big family, because I'm like the eldest of 6, that things like furniture they're functional and they're practical, but like they have to be well made and you want them to be beautiful too, right? So, I mean, you're sitting on 5-gallon buckets and stacks of books, and so that probably has a lot to do with like me going into furniture from hula. And I don't think it's a strange connection at all, because I've always been raised in like large groups of people from the community, and there was always lots of us. And so furniture, I feel like, ranges from like a chair to like something a tool you might use to clean a fish. And I think we all have those kinds of things in common. So yeah, so furniture. I love chairs. And I went away to school for 3 years and I came back. And now I teach art at the Hawaiʻi Immersion School, amongst my 100 side jobs that I do, because I got my hands in everything and I like to make things. And I would say that I use lauhala the most, but that I wouldn't say that that's like, because I like everything. I want to make something out of everything, and everything I see, like I see a rock and I see a chair, and yeah, so yeah, those are some of the things I do. Some of my side projects are like, I'm the window dresser at Sig Zane, and I don't know, teach weaving on the side. I have like a couple guys who come over and we do dyeing once a week, like trying out new berries and new leaves and stuff and seeing what kind of colors we get. So I don't know. I'll put my hand in anything that I have time for. Mahalo.
Thank you. So my second question is there something about Hawaii Island museums and related historical repositories that excite you as an individual? You know, is there certain places or things that they have that intrigues you? And so we'll start with Noinai.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the things that aren't obvious repositories in museums. Okay. Also, one of the other things I do, one of the many boards and commissions I work on, is as Friends of Liliʻuokalani Gardens. And one would not think of it as a museum or a repository, and yet it is a very historic site. And what the Friends is doing and in working with the county is trying to maintain its cultural and historic record. You know, trying to make sure that we can retain what's physically there, and even do the research and go and restore what may be missing or what may have been damaged over time, because as you know, it's next to the ocean and it suffers from not only environmental damage, but sometimes just mischief action from some parts of our community. And so every piece of every relic that's there, every lantern, most stones that are placed purposely in the gardens, and the features of the gardens, like the tea house, they're gifts from other countries, gifts from individuals, gifts from different prefectures in Japan, and a definite part of our cultural history. It's not just about our Hawaiian history, it's also about our immigration history in that period of time. And so, you know, there are places like that. It's not the only place around our community that captures that record of ourselves as a community, as well as our collective history on the island. And so I think if we just sort of brought in our definition or our look at these places as not necessarily all being bricks and mortar, but being, you know, in these other elements as well, and then finally, at one time, although this never came to fruition, along with the Edith Kanakole Foundation, we really talked a lot about trying to create a repository for those families who have material culture that are being lost because the families don't know how to curate them, because the families that are left with some of the belongings of their kupuna don't understand the value of some of these things. And you know, as an example, even on Mauna Kea this last year, where I've spent much of my time, we were given gifts, and I was personally given gifts from families who felt that they had certain pieces that are quite historical, I think, that were given to them, and they had no place to put them and didn't know what to do with them, and they would bring them and hand them to us and say, this is a Bible from, you know, a particular ali'i, and so you know, those kinds of those kinds of records, those kinds of family collections, which is also a part of museology and collection, are things that we still have to take care of in our community, and perhaps not enough attention is given to it.
Thank you so much for that, and I appreciate how you're broadening our understanding of, you know, what counts as a museum, or even just collecting, and who ends up with certain kinds of collections. It's such an important point to make. Lynn, would you like to take a stab at this question? What excites you about Hawaii Island institutions?
It excites me a lot that I get to work in Hawaii with other people of like mind, and with things of Hawaii, and working towards the same goals, I think. Even if, I thought about this a lot, Helena. You know, even if we collect similar things, there is a story to share in the history of Hawaii, whether from our kupuna, from the past, and everybody that's here now forward. It's really where we are, and how we convey that story out to the people who come to visit institutions or go to Liliuokalani Gardens, or are even educated in Hawaii. So museums and historical repositories have a role, but we as people in museums are also like the schools. We have to think about it. How are we going to get this message out? We shouldn't think that we're the sole place that has the knowledge. And it's important that we talk to one another, work with one another, kokua one another. You know, it's important. Like Teresa said, you know, to collaborate. And we won't know anything if we don't try to take that step. As Helen said, you know, I just find it wonderful to just hear them talk. So, you know, assess it, self-assessment, go out there, be bold, take the step, and reach out. And just do it, I think. So that excites me about Hawaii Museums. We have similar collections, but we use what we have to convey certain messages. So it's important that, you know, the Laimi Museum considers itself as a general museum, a Hawaiian history museum. But we have a natural history collection, and then we have gems and minerals from around the world. We have worldwide seashell collection. But we also, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. I lost my train of thought, I think.
No worries. Well,
okay.
we can.
But it's important for us to get out there and work with our community.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
And I do that almost every time I get a phone call. And you know, I think I learned all of that over time, how to work with the different people that are here, no matter what their background is. And to me, it's important that they know that what you have especially if it comes from it's a generational item that you have over time, or something that you have that you cherish. It's important for you to know that it's important to you, and when you release it to a museum, you have to think about it being important to a much broader audience, way bigger than just you. But for institutions, we need to collect that memory of that person who's going to donate it to the institution. It's very important to collect that memory, because that's part of what you don't want to lose. If it's there, and if they can convey it to you, it's important that we capture it at the get-go, because you don't want to lose that connection from where that item was with the people, because that's a story you want to make sure you can also convey to the broader audience that's out there. So I like what Noi Noi said, you don't have to be brick and mortar. And that's the beauty of Hawaii, because you see all of this happening around. People taking care of things. Stewardship, I think, is very important. And whatever you can do to contribute to that, it's important. Yeah. And museums have a role in being those stewards. And it's not, it's your collections, it's things you have, it's making sure you get that message out to people about what you have and interpreting that. But we can do a better job at doing that. And you don't have to be inside walls to share knowledge. Yeah. Okay. Mahalo.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, Ili, what are some things that excite you about our institutions?
Okay, that's hard stuff to follow. Okay. So I think that, I was really lucky to grow up in the halau where, the ho'ike, or the, exhibiting your work is constantly happening, on a daily basis. In addition to the practice you're doing, the adornments that you're wearing, all of that is your work, your foot movements, your hand movements, and all of that stuff. And you're sort of when you're dancing, you're always on display in a sense. And so my gallery space has always been, in showing my work, has always been stages, oceans. I mean, everything becomes your gallery space. And then now when my work is, I'm still dancing, but still now I have other kinds of work where they're a little bit more, not necessarily tangible, because the other stuff was tangible, but, works that are presented of mine where maybe my face doesn't play a part in it. Then the gallery spaces, gallery spaces become museums and shops and those kinds of things, craft fairs even. And I think that Hawaii has the potential, Hawaii Island has the potential to be that hub, to exhibit all this good stuff, because we really are unique in this place. The kinds of things that we have in a space where resources are vast but limited, in a sense, we got really good stuff if you know how to collect things. And that's definitely something I learned in the halau, collection of materials and how to malamarem and that kind of stuff. But then we're limited in resources in terms of if I need something welded, I gotta go find one uncle. You know what I mean? There's not I cannot just take it to a shop, because when I was getting my master's, I was in Rhode Island, and it's industrial revolution happened there. You can call for a piece of foam and the truck is going to bring it from New York, in a few hours. And Hilo, you can't do that. You have so many things are not at your fingertips, but in another way, so many things are at your fingertips. And so I think that Hawaii Island could possibly be super good spot for us exhibiting the unique things about this place and other work, so that people on our island can also learn about things from other places. Because how do you learn more about yourself? You learn more about other people. There has to be that kind of exchange. And so I think the potential of it, I'm not sure we're there yet. I think we got lots of work to do. I think In my experience, the museums and repositories of this island are not super accessible. In terms of myself, in terms of showing my work, in terms of using it for my students' resources, it hasn't been super accessible for me, but I think that there's a good potential. And I've recently joined the gallery committee of East Hawaiʻi Cultural Center. And I'm very new to this group, and it's a group of old men. And they're a very hard bunch, and I'm not sure if they're ready for me yet. I can handle them. I'm not sure if they can handle me yet, but we'll see. Who knows? I mean, we haven't really done anything because of COVID, but I think that, like, they're not getting rid of me easily. So they're in for who knows? We'll see what happens. But I'm excited because I feel like I have lots of stuff to learn from them. But I feel like I also, as a woman and as like somebody who's younger than them and somebody who grew up here, like I feel like I have something to offer, but when it's time. So, yeah.
Oh, see, this is why I was looking forward to this panel. Not just because I'm from Hilo, but, I believe that too. Hawaii Island, and in using Teresa's word, there's a lot of ingenuity going on here that I think gets underrepresented because when we think of museums, Oahu is kind of the hub. Oahu is where people write about museums and it gets published. But there's so many smaller places and folks who aren't even within a museum kind of field or in a gallery space that are doing such amazing work. And I think you're an excellent example of that. So thank you for sharing. And you kind of transitioned us to our next question on do you think are some of the improvements that could take place within our island institutions here on the island? What are some things that you can think of that they could do to bring in more community, to be more relevant, to be these places that foster this ingenuity that you've brought up? So let's start with Dr. Wong Wilson.
All right. Well, like you say, I think that we have many of the elements already of opportunities in our community, and I'll just say, as an example, Lyman Museum sits right there on the edge of old historic Hilo town, and I don't think enough attention and enough due has been given to that historic district and the work that's been put into it so far, by the shop owners and by the people investing their ownership in the businesses that exist down there. I think historic downtown Hilo should be a much bigger destination than it is, but it's going to take the will of our community to get behind it. And that will of the community is what's needed to provide more funding for Lyman Museum so that it is an integral part of our downtown space, and that space that's a must go to when people come. So we've got that museum, Lyman. We've got the Pacific Tsunami Museum. We've got great empty spaces that could be other types of exhibit spaces and museums. We have artisans over here that are unparalleled anywhere around the world, and certainly here in Hawaii. There's really no reason other than our collective focus and our collective community will. So I'll just give you an example, yeah. So another one of my projects that I'm working on is called Aina Aloha Economic Futures. And that Economic Futures initiative really comes in response to the state's non-response to the COVID-19 pandemic here in Hawaii. And what we're saying is that the communities should have the ability to just make those decisions for themselves, and we cannot be waiting for others to be answering our questions for us or coming to the rescue. So how do we recover? How does our economy recover? It recovers because we come together as a community and we decide this is what we want to do. And that's the very first step, but it's the most important step, like we know, the olelo no eao about the first step in a journey. Yeah. The hardest step in a journey is that first step. But that's it. And if we can do that, and if we can incorporate not only our historic downtown architecture, because that's certainly part of it, but it's our own unique history we have over here, our people, which is certainly one of our biggest assets, and the fact that we have these collections and that we can enhance those collections, and we have our artisans, so that it can be not only an economic reality for us, but it will help us in that area of repository and museums and maintaining our identity. That's what it's supposed to all be about, right? Yeah, we can do a job. We can do a good job of it. We just have to come together to do it.
Awesome, wonderful. All right, Lynn, what are some areas of improvement that you see?
What is the question again?
The question is, from your perspective, what is an area of improvement that Hawaii Island museums and related historical repositories can work on?
Well, Helena, I think you helped us in that, the Lyman Museum. An area of improvement for the Lyman Museum, and this goes to the gallery that we're still working on, our Island Heritage Gallery. So in conversations with you, were you already away, or were you still back at Hilo? Away?
I was in Denver, yes, and I came back for some research.
So when Helena came back, we're still, in the thinking about what can we do as a general Hawaiian history museum. What is it? There's so many others that are saying the same story or telling the similar stories. And so what Helena put in our mind to be mindful of is, why don't you bring it back here to this island and put history put Hawaii's history in the eyes of the people here on this island. How was Hawaii Island's role? What roles did they have in history? And what roles are we going to have in the history? Because you cannot just say, everything is only, over here in Oahu or this and this. But to come back and take a look at self-assessing where you are and thinking about how you're going to tell that story. And that was like a moment. And we all sat down and, because I'm not the only thinker there are other people I have to think with. and it was good. So it made us reassess and how we look at what we talk about, what we convey to the public that we serve. But it also helped me to rethink about how we collect things as well. And because you might lose something that's more important here than it is to somewhere else. Or if you get something from Kauai, that somebody gives you that's from Kauai, or even Papua New Guinea wants to donate to you, you have people you can talk to or say, it belongs here perhaps. And you build that relationship and you begin to share. And stories can be told all over the world. And that's globalization, I think. And finding, like Eli said, sometimes you have to learn about somebody else or some other culture before you even learn about yours. And that's, that's my ka'i. Yeah. So, Helena, you are the ones. So what area of improvement? Yeah, I say listen to the voices that are out there. And take a look at what the voices are saying. I mean, not just hear it, but look at it and see what they're saying and bring that in. And it's okay if it's controversial. I don't think that's something we should shy away from. I think it's important that we convey it, both sides. Yeah, and have people make those decisions on your own. And that's what institutions have to realize. You cannot, well, I shouldn't say you cannot. You can convey the message But how that person you're conveying it to and interpreting it to, they become the vehicle for what's shared. So they can change it to the way they want to, but at least you've shared it with them so they have a better understanding. Or, yeah, you give them some knowledge. You give them that knowledge. Let them make the decision. Yeah. Okay, that's the improvement.
Okay, thanks, Lynn.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're fine. No, you're no worries.
Okay.
So, Ely, you've started to talk a little bit about this with regards to access. Is there anything else you wanted to add with regards to some improvements that you see, particularly as a maker? Like, what are some of the things that you see could be done better within our institutions here on island?
Yeah, I want to see some movement. Like, I feel like most of the places here that are, besides like, street front galleries and spaces like that, where I feel like they're really specific to a certain kind of work that's going on, not to say that it's not good work, but, a little bit more photography and paintings of turtles and ocean scenes. I want to see some movement in terms of spaces that like work is moving in and out, that we're using it almost like a library scene. So I went to an art school where the main museum at the school was like a library. So you could call in and say, hey, I'm doing a project on this. I want to see this collection. And you could go in and like somebody would bring out the collection for you and you could sit there and you could, of course with rules and stuff and make sure that everything was being malamat, but like you used it like a library, like you bring the collection out, you can do some studies because maybe you were designing a pot to, I don't know, do something. You're going to go into the museum, you're going to look at their collections and make some design decisions based on that. I do think that like sometimes like, I feel like I'm just a maker. I don't really I wouldn't call myself an artist. Maybe more of a designer, and hopefully like if my designs are like good enough to be called art, then hey, that's amazing. But yeah, like I want to see things coming in and out. I feel like, we don't have the space like Honolulu Museum of Art, but they have their displays that are there for good, and then they have a couple exhibit spaces where work is coming in and out. And I've also worked closely with the people at Wailoa, and I feel like there's a lot of rules about what you can and cannot display there. So I think that's, who gets to say what's good art? If it's your space, you get to control it, but still, I think there should be room for us to have a larger worldview and show kids that like museums and galleries are not just about like looking at things. Like they should be spaces where we can learn stuff. Kamehameha schools also had this like collection of, I forget what his name was, like some kahu had a bunch of wooden bowls and functional art objects, old stuff that were like poi boards and poi pounders and those kinds of utilitarian objects. And so I was working with them for a little while because I wanted to do a project with my students, and I wanted to have access to these objects. I said, I want them to come and study it, and we want to look at like these simple functional objects that did these like huge jobs, right? And like, because nowadays everything's so complicated. When you go buy a spatula, it has like 10 functions when really it doesn't need it. So I was working together with a couple people from Kamehameha schools because I wanted my students to see these objects. And I was like, well, what if we set up a display, like found a space where we could set up a display and multiple groups could go through and we could use it for learning. And there was just so much back and forth. And then in the end, we never even got to see the objects. Like they gave me a Xerox copy of like in black and white of what these things were. And like they were the one who presented it to us and said, hey, somebody donated these objects. What do you guys think? How can we use them? And then it never happened. So I think that like a lot of things get lost in the like worrying about, I don't know how to explain that, but I want to see movement.
Budget line item. Budget
Yeah,
line item.
budget
With
line
love,
item.
movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all for those responses. Now, our next question is in relation to our previous panel that we just filmed. And that panel dealt with describing this framework of cultural competency that we're working with. But as cultural competence educators, we're not necessarily, we chose to refer to ourselves as educators rather than as experts because we recognize that every person is going to have a different operating definition of cultural competence when they actually use it. So we wanted to provide an opportunity for you folks to comment on how do you, I mean, based on kind of the things we've said, but things that you've thought about throughout your career and lifetime, what does cultural competence mean to each of you? And so we'll start with you.
Okay. Actually, this is a challenging question. And I think, as you say, you know, there's a different definition, different perspective for different groups of people. For me, cultural competency is in recognizing the source of that knowledge or the source of that cultural wisdom of the ike. You know, not all of us are raised in the same halau. Not all of us come from the very same family traditions. So what's true for you and the family traditions that are passed down in your family is going to be probably most likely a little bit different from mine. So we always have to regard, I think, when we have this ability to exchange with each other, then that's exactly what we're doing. We're each giving our own perspective of you know, a piece of culture, piece of history, something that relates to us. And I think in addition to cultural competency, there's the term relevancy, right? And so, you know, there's a whole like theory of all of this in anthropology, but really it's about a couple points that I want to make. First of all, the fact that you are the source yourself. You know, each of us individual, as we share it with others, I think has to be recognized. That my source is different from yours has to be acknowledged and accepted by each other. And so even in Hawaii, for example, you know, are we one tribe or are we a nation of tribes? You know, and the fact that we come from not only differences on our own island, on our moku, but within our districts, and how Ka'u has particular practices that are really different from Kohala or Puna, you know. And so when we study about our own cultural history, we have to really acknowledge those differences, because even within the districts, there's family differences, right? So cultural competency just has to be always viewed from those perspectives, I think. And if we do, and we allow room for each other to bring their ike to the space, then I think we'll be fine. It's when you believe that you know better, or that your ike is correct and someone else's is not, is when we run into problems.
Right. Mahalo. Lynn, what do you think cultural competency? What is your definition?
Listening to the webinars that you've hosted with Teresa and Helen, I think it's changed my perspective a lot. But basically, I think is, again, knowing what you know, and feeling comfortable with that, and perhaps even confident in that, and knowing that you're not the only one. I'm not the one with all of that. Others may think you are the one or tell you that, but you are not the one. You are not the one. You are the one who has this. And if you can share that and help them to see that in you, that you are not the one who knows everything. One of the things that I heard from my years at the institution, well, I shouldn't say institution, at the Lyman Museum, because that's where I've worked my whole life, pretty much. And I believe in that institution, and I believe in the values or the mission that they have put out from the very get-go in 1931. And in 1931, it was to be with your community, to help your community, to come bring the world, like Orlando would have said, bring the Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii. And I think that's Ili's movement. Maybe. Yeah, part of that. But, you know, it's, yeah, you just, I'm an institutional memory, but, and I like it. Because if I can share the message of anybody else who's worked there before me, which is important to me, all of those who have come before me, who's worked there, then I get to share. That is where I feel comfortable. That is where I feel confident. That I get to continue this message or be the source as the institutional memory for that particular thing. And so, yeah, that's cultural competency for me too. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And Ili, what does cultural competency mean to you?
I cover all the things that everybody said, and I think it's about awareness and respect and you know, a little bit of tolerance. Sometimes it's like you don't have to be like the other person. You don't have to believe the same thing as they believe, but you need to be respectful of their traditions and their customs and yeah.
Yeah. I can say one more thing, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that is always a challenge, and we find it in academia. You know, academia, it's a wonderful world to live in and come from, but it also has its great challenges. And you know, coming from the discipline of anthropology and how it changed over the generations and the centuries, that cultural, to me, the issue of cultural competency is much more valid now, because now there's a much better recognition that the source of the information is indeed the native to that space and not the visitor who came to study the native for a couple of years and now writes the book. So we still fight back against that. But one of the phenomenon that I see happening in our own community here in Hawaii is more and more people like you, Helena, who have your advanced degrees in this area, that, you know, because we're in academia, that's what it requires to stand up against any other academic, to write our papers, to get into print, those kinds of things that students who come after you can follow and cite, you know, and the native voice, especially Hawaiians, that has become a much larger group of people. And we're beginning to, and not just beginning, we are successful in writing our own history. And so all the books that I started out reading and citing from, which were mainly missionaries, you know, who came back in the 1800s, have been replaced now by a whole generation of sources, valid, academic, juried sources of writings of our own people who have pretty much debunked a lot of the old theories and a lot of the old philosophies. So cultural competency over time has changed, and it's terrible. It's not terrible. It's a terribly good recognition of the fact that the native voice is a valid voice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that's where we are now. I think we're there.
Thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
All right, so we're reaching the end of our conversation, and we're going to go to our last question, and let's keep our kind of remarks nice and concise. So for this question, it's if you could give advice to a Hawaiian or a local student interested in working in museums or related repositories or even in an exhibition kind of space, what would that advice be? And since you've just responded, how about we jump to Lynn for this first response?
Be persistent. I think it's be persistent in pursuing what you think you're headed towards, and work hard at it, and be persistent with museums and other repositories and opening their doors, kokua them, become a member. Well, and most of all, I think, is, again, taking that step. No matter what kind of place it is, no matter what you think of it, you need to take that first step to go there. And I did have an experience with one student like that, who was from Oahu, who's Hawaiian, and we were working on the conservation of some Hawaiian artifacts, which we will have on exhibit. And this student was from Oahu, Waianae, and I had him work on rehousing kapa beaters and making the boxes, stabilizing the object in there. And these are, historic kapa beaters. And we were probably in a month, maybe less than a month of work. And then he came, I was showing him how to do the boxes and then putting the kapa beaters in them. And he goes, "Auntie, it's not what they say. It's not true." And I said, "Huh? What's not true?" And he says, "It's not true what they say about museums, that they don't like, that, we cannot touch these things and we cannot see it, or, they just tick, tick, tick." I said, "Oh, okay." I think his name was Carlos. And, I felt really good because I said, if you get that just by being here and helping out, I think it's important. It makes me feel good that at least it's changed your perspective. And I think, so it has to be two ways. And that made me feel really good to hear that. And I love working with college students. They're just like a sieve, sort of. And you can talk, you can share a lot. And I think being at the Laimi Museum, I think it's important for them to know things. And we are the holder of keys. And we should be able to open the doors for the ones who are there knocking. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Ili, any advice for future Ilis?
Future Elis, I think be present, be participatory, and be curious, and figure out what your practice is so that you have a lens. Because I think that, I don't think I chose to join hula, but that's where I went. And my hula lens has, I can't imagine what I would be without the hula lens. So definitely find your practice and practice it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Noinoi Wangwelson, you get the last word of this question and conversation.
I think, museum studies, repositories, they're an exciting field. What I would suggest to a young person looking at it is save your money and apply for every grant that you could possibly apply for. Travel and visit all of the most awesome museums, not only in Hawaii, but around the world. Te Papa Museum in Aotearoa, I was fortunate enough to be there in Aotearoa when they opened the museum. I think is a really beautifully designed modern style museum. And I also think a side talent to museum studies is technology. Educational technology, because that is going to be part of the future of museums, and I think a new student coming in is going to be a part of that phenomenon. So that would be my 2 cents. And then bury your feet deep in the aina over here in Hawaii.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mahalo. All right, so mahalo and noi iliahi. Amelin, thank you so much for this conversation. Ano leila e nā hoa ua hoʻea kākou I ka hopena o keia papahana. We've reached the end of this program. We hope that you've enjoyed the conversations that have taken place today around Mākau moʻomeheu, or cultural competence. And as I've mentioned at the beginning of this program, if you'd like to know more or to watch some of our previous webinars or conversations, you can visit the Hawaiʻi Museums Association Cultural Competence website page, which is www.hawaiimuseums.org/Mākau. You can Google it, you can type it in directly, and you'll find all of our materials there and more. So mahalo nui loa, and we hope to see you next time. Aloha no.